The day my brother-in-law had security escort me out of the building I'd spent 11 years building, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I picked up my leather portfolio, buttoned my blazer, and said 2 words that made his smirk falter just slightly. Thank you. He didn't understand what I meant. He wouldn't. Not until the following Thursday, when Hargrove and Associates called an emergency board meeting and read aloud a shareholder agreement that had been sitting quietly in a Toronto law firm's vault for the past 3 years, signed, witnessed, and completely uncontestable. By Friday morning, I was the majority stakeholder of Caldwell Logistics Group, and my brother-in-law was applying for jobs on LinkedIn. But let me start from the beginning. My name is Rachel Mercer. My maiden name. I took it back 18 months ago, and I've never once regretted it. I'm 41 years old. I was born and raised in Hamilton, Ontario, and I have spent the better part of my adult life working in freight and supply chain logistics, an industry that, even now, still raises an eyebrow when a woman walks into a room and sits at the head of the table. I stopped noticing the eyebrows years ago. I started noticing the numbers, instead. The numbers never lied. I joined Caldwell Logistics Group 12 years ago as a junior operations analyst. The company was mid-sized, then solid regional presence across Ontario and Quebec. About 400 employees. Contracts with several municipal governments and a handful of large retailers. The kind of company that had been built by one man's hands and stubbornness over 3 decades, and that could feel it in every hallway. That man was Douglas Caldwell. Douglas was 63 when I started. He was the kind of person who still wrote notes by hand in a leather-bound journal, who remembered every employee's name on the floor, and who believed, with a conviction I've rarely seen in anyone, that the right person for a job was whoever was actually best at it, full stop. Not whoever had the right last name. Not whoever played golf with the right people. Whoever could do the work. He noticed me within my first year. Not in any inappropriate way. Douglas wasn't that kind of man. He noticed that my quarterly risk assessments were flagging problems 3 months before they became problems, and that 2 of my recommendations had saved the company a combined total of just under $800,000. He called me into his office one afternoon in November, offered me a coffee, and said, without any preamble, "You see things other people miss. I want you to keep doing that." That was the beginning of everything. Over the following years, I moved up. Operations analyst to senior analyst, then to director of strategic risk, then to VP of operations. I was 34 when Douglas made me chief operating officer. I was the youngest person ever to hold that title at Caldwell, and the first woman. The announcement went out on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, I had already received 3 emails from colleagues congratulating me and one from my then husband's brother, Daniel Caldwell, that said simply, "Interesting choice." I should tell you about Daniel. He was 2 years younger than me, Douglas's only son. And he had worked at the company for just under 4 years when I was promoted. His actual job title was Director of Business Development, though in practice he spent most of his time attending industry events, taking clients to Leafs games, and sending emails with a lot of exclamation marks and very little substance. He was charming in the way that men who've never been told no tend to be, charming effortlessly, and with the quiet assumption that it would always be enough. My husband, then Marcus, Daniel's younger cousin on the other side, had introduced us at a family gathering 6 years before I was made COO. Marcus was kind and steady, and we had a good partnership for a long time. But marriages change, and people change. And by the time Douglas promoted me, Marcus and I had already quietly grown into something more like roommates than partners. We stayed together because it was easier than leaving, and because neither of us was ready to say out loud what we both already knew. What mattered, professionally, was Daniel. He had always assumed, with the particular confidence of someone who has never questioned their own assumptions, that he would one day run his father's company. It was not an unreasonable expectation, on the surface. He was the founder's son. He had a business degree from Western. He had been there long enough to know most of the clients by name. In a different kind of company, in a different era, he probably would have gotten what he expected. But Douglas was not interested in legacy by birthright. He was interested in the company surviving. Thriving. Continuing to mean something after he was gone. And he had been watching both of us for years. I did not know, at the time, how carefully he had been watching. The years I spent as COO were the most demanding of my career. We expanded into British Columbia and Alberta. We renegotiated our federal contracts. I oversaw a full restructuring of our warehouse management systems that reduced our operating costs by 14% in 18 months. Douglas was present through all of it, asking questions, pushing back when he disagreed, and then, when I'd made my case, saying all right. Let's do it. He trusted me in the way that very few people had trusted me in my professional life. Not because I was likable. I was told more than once that I could be difficult, which I understood to mean I didn't back down from being right. But because I had earned it. Every number I'd put in front of him had been real. We disagreed, sometimes. There was a potential acquisition in Winnipeg that I advised against and that he wanted to pursue. We went back and forth for 6 weeks. I brought data, he brought instinct, and we eventually found a middle path that cost less and delivered more. Afterward, he said something to me I've thought about many times since. He said, "You know what I appreciate most about you, Rachel? You never tell me what you think I want to hear." I didn't realize, then, that he was already thinking about what came next. Marcus and I separated quietly in the spring, 3 years before everything changed. There were no dramatic scenes, no accusations, no lawyers at dawn. We sat at our kitchen table in our house in Oakville, drank tea, and agreed that we had made a good life together and it was time to make separate ones. We split everything fairly. I kept the cat, he kept the cottage. Daniel found out before the ink was dry. He said something at the next family dinner that was framed as a joke but wasn't something about whether my position at the company would be complicated now. I looked at him across the table and said that my position at the company had always been entirely my own. Douglas, at the end of the table, said nothing. But I saw the look on his face. 8 months after Marcus and I separated, Douglas had his first heart attack. He recovered well, or seemed to. He came back to the office, reduced his hours slightly, deferred more decisions to me. He never said explicitly that he was preparing me for something. He began, instead, to include me in conversations I hadn't previously been part of. Board conversations. Long-term ownership conversations. Meetings with Hargrove and Associates, the firm that had handled Caldwell's legal work for 20 years. I thought he was being cautious. Building redundancy, as he always had. I didn't ask questions I wasn't entitled to ask. The second heart attack came 14 months later. This one was worse. Douglas was in the ICU for 11 days. I ran the company from a folding chair in a hospital waiting room half the time and from the office the other half. I did not sleep more than 5 hours on any of those nights. Daniel appeared at the hospital sporadically, spent a great deal of time on the phone in the parking lot, and forwarded me 2 emails during those 11 days with the subject line "Handle this." Douglas came home. He was not the same. He was still sharp, still the man I knew, in the ways that mattered. But he was slower. Tired in a way that didn't lift. He started working exclusively from home. He called me every morning at 8:30, and we talked through whatever needed to be discussed. And he always ended the call the same way, with the same words. "Keep it running, Rachel." And I did. Daniel, during this period, became suddenly very interested in the company. He began requesting meetings with board members individually. He started copying himself on communications that hadn't previously involved him. He redesigned his own email signature to read Daniel Caldwell Logistics Group, Office of the President, which was a title that did not exist and that no one had given him. I brought it to Douglas's attention. Douglas was quiet for a moment and then said, "I know." That was all. I didn't push. I should have asked more questions. Instead, I trusted that Douglas had things in hand. He did. In ways I didn't yet understand. The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. Douglas had passed away in his sleep. He was 69 years old. He had been declining faster than any of us had been told. It turned out, or faster than he'd been willing to tell. The funeral was held the following Saturday, in Burlington, and half the freight industry in Ontario showed up. I sat in the third row and did not cry because I could not afford to start and not be able to stop. Daniel sat in the front row in a suit I'd never seen before. And by Sunday evening he had already sent an email to the full staff announcing that he would be assuming the role of President and CEO of Caldwell Logistics Group effective immediately, in accordance with his father's wishes. No board meeting. No announcement from legal. No consultation with anyone. Just the email. Just the title. I replied to Daniel directly and copied our board chair, noting that executive succession required board ratification under our articles of incorporation and asking when that meeting would be scheduled. He replied 40 minutes later, also copying the board chair, with the following. Thanks, Rachel, I'll take it from here in terms of board coordination. Can you focus on operations for now? I stared at that email for a long time. I focused on operations. The board meeting happened the following Wednesday. I found out from our CFO, Priya, who attended and who called me afterward, her voice carefully controlled, to tell me that the board had ratified Daniel as CEO. There had been some discussion, she said. It had not been unanimous. But it had passed. That night I sat in my living room in Oakville with my cat on my lap and a glass of Pinot Gris I wasn't drinking, and I thought about what Douglas had said to me, over and over, in those last months. The morning calls. Keep it running, Rachel. The meetings with Hargrove and Associates that I'd been included in but never fully understood the purpose of. The way he'd looked at me across that dinner table when Daniel made his comment about complications. I thought, he knew. He knew exactly what was coming. And he was not the kind of man who left things to chance. I went to work Thursday morning the same as always. My badge still worked. My office was still mine. The team was watching me the way teams watch leaders when things are uncertain, looking for signals, looking for steadiness. I gave them steady. Daniel arrived at 10:15, with a new laptop bag, and the particular energy of a man who has been waiting his whole life for something, and has finally gotten it. He stopped by my office, leaned in the doorway, and told me he was going to need to make some organizational changes. He wanted to bring in someone to refresh the ops perspective. He appreciated everything I'd contributed over the years. I looked at him and said, let's schedule a proper transition meeting so nothing falls through the cracks. He said he'd have his assistant reach out. His assistant reached out at 4:50 on Friday afternoon, 48 hours later, with a meeting invitation for Monday morning that had a single agenda item. Role transition discussion. I accepted the invitation. Then I called Hargrove and Associates. Not to ask for help. Just to say that I'd been thinking about the conversations Douglas and I had had with them, and that I wanted to understand the full scope of what had been discussed. The paralegal I reached was very professional. She said she would note my inquiry and have someone follow up. Someone followed up on Sunday evening. It was one of the senior partners, calling from his personal phone, which told me something before he'd said a word. He asked how I was doing. I said I was managing. He said Douglas had left specific instructions for exactly this scenario, and that there was documentation I needed to be aware of. He asked if I could come in Monday morning, before my meeting with Daniel. I was there at 7:30. The shareholder agreement had been drafted 3 years earlier, during a quiet period when Douglas had still seemed healthy but had clearly been thinking about mortality in ways none of us had known. It was comprehensive, legally airtight, and witnessed by 2 independent parties. It transferred to me, upon Douglas Caldwell's death, 49% of the common shares in Caldwell Logistics Group, in addition to the 2% I had been quietly granted as part of my executive compensation package over the years, a detail that had been buried in my employment agreements in language I had signed but not fully parsed at the time. 51%. Total. Douglas had retained 14%, now part of his estate held in trust with specific instructions that they not be sold for a period of 5 years, and that any major decisions during that period required the agreement of the majority shareholder. Which was me. Daniel held 33%. The remaining 2% was distributed among 3 long-serving board members. I sat in the boardroom at Hargrove and Associates at 7:30 in the morning and read every page of that document twice. Then I sat quietly for a moment, thinking about a man who had called me every morning at 8:30 and always ended the call the same way. And I understood, finally, what he had been preparing me for. I arrived at the office at 9:15. Daniel was already there, moving furniture in what had been his father's office, which he had not yet technically been authorized to occupy. I walked past without stopping. At 9:50, with our board chair and CFO both present, I provided copies of the shareholder agreement to everyone in the room, along with a brief summary prepared by Hargrove and Associates. I said nothing dramatic. I didn't need to. The document said everything. The meeting with Daniel at 10 o'clock did not go as he had planned. He went through several phases quickly. First was confusion. He kept asking where this document had come from, as if that were the relevant question. Then came anger, directed at me, as though I had manufactured the agreement myself, as if I had somehow tricked a dying man into protecting what he had already decided was mine. He said several things I won't repeat. He said his father hadn't been in his right mind. He said the document would be challenged. It was not challenged. Douglas had been meticulous. 3 years earlier, at the time of signing, he had obtained a statement from his physician confirming his full cognitive capacity. He had anticipated exactly this. Our board chair, to his credit, was calm and professional throughout. He called a break, spoke privately with Daniel for 20 minutes, and returned to confirm that the board would be convening a formal meeting within the week to formally recognize the shareholder agreement and address governance accordingly. Daniel resigned 2 weeks later, before that meeting took place. He negotiated a buyout of his 33% at fair market value, which our estate lawyers and his lawyers agreed on after 3 weeks of back and forth. It was a significant sum of money. He would not need to work, if he was careful. Whether Daniel Caldwell would be careful with money was, at that point, no longer my problem. The restructuring of Caldwell Logistics Group's leadership began the week after Daniel left. Priya was promoted to Chief Financial Officer. She had been doing the job in all but title for 2 years already. I brought in a new VP of Operations from outside, a woman named Simone who had 15 years of experience in Western Canadian freight. We redesigned the executive structure to be flatter, more functional, more honest about where the real work was happening. I moved into the CEO's office, though I kept it exactly as Douglas had kept it, except for one thing. I added a small framed card on the desk, facing me, in Douglas's handwriting. He had sent it to me 4 months before he died, tucked into a folder of documents I hadn't opened until that Sunday afternoon at my kitchen table. It said, "The company will be fine, I made sure of it. D." I understand, now, why he didn't tell me explicitly. If he had, the conversation would have been about me trying to convince him there were other options. He knew that. He knew me. So he did what he had always done when we disagreed. He made his case not with words but with numbers, with documents, with things that couldn't be argued with once they were in front of you. He trusted me to run it. And I trusted him to know what he was doing. There are people, I've heard it said, more than once, in more than one context, who believe that what I received was outsized, that it was unusual, that there must have been something more to the relationship between Douglas and me than a professional one. I want to say clearly and without defensiveness, there was. He was a mentor in the truest sense. He was, in some ways, the professional father I had never had, someone who saw what I was capable of before I fully saw it myself, and who structured everything around making sure that capability had somewhere to go. That's not a small thing. That's not a common thing. I have worked in this industry long enough to know exactly how uncommon it is. I am 41 years old. I am the president and CEO of Caldwell Logistics Group, which now operates across 6 provinces with just under 900 employees. Last year we posted our strongest annual revenue in company history. We have contracts with 2 federal agencies, partnerships, across the border into Ontario and Manitoba. And a reputation for doing what we say we're going to do. Every morning at 8:30, I sit at my desk and I think about a phone call that doesn't come anymore. And I think about what it means to build something that lasts, not just in the numbers, not just in the contracts, but in the people you choose to trust with it when you're gone. Douglas Caldwell chose well. I intend to prove that for as long as I'm here.